The Newark police report called it a syndicate ambush. 6 bodies, 1 survivor. Case closed. But the report never mentioned that Choi Gi-hun, the most feared Korean crime lord on the eastern seaboard, was on his knees in the dirt, bleeding, unarmed, and completely out of moves. It never mentioned that no one from his syndicate came for him. It never mentioned that the person who walked through that warehouse door wasn't a soldier, wasn't a bodyguard, wasn't even armed at first glance. She was wearing a quick-drop delivery uniform. She had a helmet under her arm, and she was complaining about a missing gate code. She cleared 6 armed men in 45 seconds. This is the story of the king who knelt in the dirt, and the girl who decided he was worth saving. The question that will haunt every page of this story is the one nobody thought to ask. Why her? Why him? And why that exact night? Newark, 2 a.m. The kind of hour that doesn't belong to working people. The shipping yards off Route 1 sat dead and waterlogged under a sky that hadn't stopped bleeding rain in 3 days. The warehouses out there rusted, forgotten, stacked between the turnpike and the dark mouth of the Passaic River. Those weren't the kind of buildings that made it onto any city map. They existed in the margin, the kind of place where powerful men made problems disappear. Tonight, one of those powerful men was the problem. Choi Gi-hun sat on a splintered wooden crate in the belly of Warehouse 14, and for the first time in 15 years, he had nothing left to calculate. His white dress shirt was open at the collar, soaked through with rainwater and something darker. A graze from a bullet had torn the skin above his left temple, a small wound, the kind that bled dramatically and meant nothing. Except tonight it meant everything, because it meant they'd already gotten close enough to touch him. The pristine Italian leather of his shoes was caked with dirt. His watch, a Patek Philippe, the same one his father had worn. The crystal cracked across the face from the struggle that had cost him his weapon sat heavy on his wrist. 6 Glock 17s were pointed at various points of his anatomy, held by men who were paid well enough not to feel anything about pulling the trigger. He had no weapon. His security detail, 3 men he had trusted with his life for a combined total of 22 years, were already dead in the parking lot outside. He knew, because the man holding the center gun, the one they called the Jackal, had told him so with a smile that showed too many teeth. 3 men, 22 years between them, gone before the warehouse door had finished rolling up. Gi-hun didn't beg. He didn't bargain. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, his breathing even, his dark eyes moving once across the semicircle of barrels aimed at his chest. He was filing it away. Every angle. Every face. Even now, even here, the mind that had built the Goryeo Syndicate from a single container yard in Incheon into a network spanning 3 continents was still running calculations. They just weren't coming out in his favor. The Jackal raised his suppressed Beretta M9, leveling it with the relaxed, professional ease of a man who had done this before and would do it again before breakfast. The steel rolling door at the front of the warehouse groaned. Not the way a door groans when the wind catches it. It groaned the way a door groans when someone on the outside is too annoyed to be cautious. A hard, impatient shove from a person running behind schedule. Every gun in the room swung toward the entrance. She walked in out of the rain. She was wearing a black quick-drop delivery jacket, the kind with the orange logo on the back that you stopped noticing 2 seconds after seeing it. A matte black helmet was tucked under her left arm. Water was running in thin rivulets down her face, tracing the line of her jaw, dripping from the tip of her nose. Her hair was pulled back under the hood. Her skin was dark and rain-slicked, and caught the single overhead work light in a way that turned her into something carved, not soft, not gentle, something precise. She didn't freeze when she saw the guns. She looked mildly inconvenienced. Okay, nobody told me there was going to be a whole situation in here. She lifted her delivery tablet, tilting the screen toward the light. I've got a bibimbap order for a... She squinted. Choi? Gate code wasn't working, so I just... She gestured vaguely at the open door behind her. I let myself in. Is someone going to sign for this, or... The Jackal stared at her. One of the gunmen to his right actually started to laugh. That was the last sound he made. What happened next happened in the language that exists below language. the grammar of velocity and proximity, and trained muscle that bypasses conscious thought entirely. The ceramic blade came from inside her jacket sleeve. It found the jackal's throat before his laugh finished. She used the momentum of his falling body as a pivot point, her left hand already stripping the M9 from his grip before his knees hit the concrete. She moved through the room the way water moves through a cracked dam, not fighting the obstacles, just finding every gap, every fraction of a second where a body is off balance and a gun is pointing at nothing useful. 2 shots, suppressed, almost polite. A third man went down to an elbow strike that sounded like a car door slamming. The last 2 she walked toward actually walked, unhurried, and they hesitated for the fatal half-second that hesitation always costs. 45 seconds. The warehouse was quiet again, except for the rain on the roof and the low mechanical idle of a delivery scooter somewhere outside. Nicole Derringer stood in the center of the room. Her breathing was measured. She checked the magazine on the stolen Beretta counted, snapped it back in, then finally looked at the man still sitting on the crate. He hadn't moved. Choi Gi-hun was staring at her with the expression of a man who had just watched the laws of physics get quietly repealed. She tilted her head, looked at him the way you look at something you've been watching from a very long distance for a very long time and are finally seeing up close. "You're late on your tip, boss." Her voice was flat, but something in her eyes, some flicker beneath the control, beneath the mask, was not. Gi-hun stood slowly. He had seen hitmen work. He had seen military contractors operate in conditions that broke other men. He had, on 2 occasions, watched his own father dismantle a room full of enemies with nothing but a glass bottle and his bare hands. He had never seen this. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't improvisation. This was choreography written into the body so deep it had become instinct. Whoever this woman was, she had not stumbled into a Newark warehouse at 2 a.m. by accident. Nothing about her was an accident. "Who are you?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. Nicole was already moving toward the exit, scanning the dark perimeter of the yard through the gap in the door. "There's a sweep team. 10 minutes out, maybe less." She didn't look back at him. "Your men outside are gone. The scooter's clean, no GPS, no plates they'll be looking for. So you can stand there asking questions, or you can come with me." She finally looked back at him over her shoulder. The rain was behind her. The light was in front of her. And in that frame, in that single suspended moment, Choi Gi-hun felt something shift behind his ribs, something he had no name for and didn't want one. He picked up his cracked watch from where it had fallen when they'd taken his weapon, fastened it back on his wrist, and followed a delivery girl into the dark. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that she had been watching him for 3 years. That every photo, every route, every carefully charted schedule of his life was folded inside a hidden compartment beneath her scooter seat. That the rescue wasn't mercy, it was the opening move, and the game had only just begun. But to understand what Nicole Derringer was doing in that warehouse, to understand why she had 3 years of photographs and a ceramic blade and the kind of calm that doesn't come from courage alone, you have to go back. Back to the beginning of Choi Gi-hun's story. Back to a boy in Incheon who watched his father disappear and built an empire out of the grief. Back to a girl whose name wasn't always Nicole, whose memories weren't always her own. You have to understand what was built before you can understand what was sent to destroy it. She cleared 6 armed men in 45 seconds and told him they needed to leave. He followed, and that was his first mistake. If you already need to know who she really is, subscribe right now because this story is going to unravel everything you think you just saw. Stay with me. The penthouse sat on the 43rd floor of a building that didn't advertise itself, no doorman, no concierge logo, no name etched in brass above the entrance. Just a keycard reader and an elevator that only went up if you knew the code. Gi-hun kept 3 properties in the tri-state area. This one didn't exist on paper. That was the point. He hadn't spoken during the drive. Neither had she. The wait between them wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind 2 people carry when they both know more than they're saying, and neither one is ready to blink first. Nicole had driven with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set. Gi-hun had watched her from the passenger seat the entire time. Not the way a man watches a woman, the way a man watches a threat he hasn't yet classified. She had killed 6 people 40 minutes ago, and her hands were completely steady on the wheel. That told him everything and nothing at the same time. The penthouse was dim when they entered. Floor-to-ceiling windows swallowed the entire north wall, and beyond the glass, Jersey City glittered in the rain. The skyline, a smear of amber and cold white light reflected on the wet streets 40 stories below. The furniture was sparse and deliberate. Dark leather, steel. No warmth, no art, no evidence that a human being actually lived here. It was a room designed for a man who didn't trust permanence. Nicole stepped inside and stopped in the center of the room. She turned slowly, taking the space in the way a person takes in an exit route, cataloging, measuring, filing. "Sit," Gi-hun said. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding through your sleeve." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Sit." She looked at him for a moment, that same flat, scanning look she'd given him in the warehouse, and then she sat on the edge of the steel-framed sofa, not relaxed, positioned, like a person who hadn't fully decided yet whether this room was safe. Gi-hun went to the cabinet beside the kitchen island and returned with a first aid kit that was significantly more comprehensive than anything a civilian stocked. He pulled a chair close and sat across from her. Close enough to work, not close enough to be careless. "Jacket," he said. Nicole unzipped it slowly and peeled it back off her left shoulder. Beneath the jacket, she wore a fitted black tactical underlayer, and below the hem of the short sleeve, a jagged 3-inch gash ran along the outside of her upper arm, shallow but ragged, the kind a ceramic blade leaves when it grazes on the way to somewhere else. Her skin was deep brown and smooth everywhere the wound wasn't, and the overhead light caught the planes of her shoulders with an almost architectural precision. She didn't look at him while he worked. Gi-hun cleaned the wound without ceremony. His hands were scarred at the knuckles-old damage, the kind written in by years rather than a single incident. They moved with the focused economy of someone who had done this for others, and had it done for himself enough times that it had become mechanical. He pressed a gauze pad to the gash, and she didn't flinch. He taped it clean, and she still didn't look at him. But her jaw tightened when his fingers lingered a half-second too long at the edge of the tape. Just a half-second, he noticed. He pulled back and set the kit aside. "You can use the room at the end of the hall. Shower. There are clothes in the wardrobe they won't fit, but they'll do." Nicole stood, picked up her delivery bag from where she'd set it by the door, then set it back down, left it there. Gi-hun's eyes moved to the bag, then back to her retreating figure as she disappeared down the hallway. He heard the bathroom door close. Heard the click of the lock, not the main lock, just the privacy latch, the kind that stopped a polite person. He crossed the room in 12 steps. The bag was good. Externally, it was exactly what it was supposed to be. The standard quick-drop canvas satchel, scuffed at the corners, the orange logo faded from use, 2 insulated compartments on top. Velcro seal. Smelled faintly of whatever the last delivery had been. He found the false bottom on the 3rd pass. A pressure release on the interior left seam, the kind of modification a person only knew to look for if they'd seen it before. He pressed it. The panel gave. What was beneath it stopped him cold. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Printed on matte stock. Cut clean. Organized. Not chaotic surveillance, curated surveillance. Gi-hun at the Han River Gym in Seoul. Earphones in. Completely unaware. Gi-hun leaving the small coffee shop on Mott Street in Manhattan, where he went on Sunday mornings because they ground the beans the way his mother used to. Gi-hun in a car park in Busan. In a hotel lobby in Singapore. At the window of his Seoul office at 11 p.m., with a glass of whiskey, and the particular expression he wore when the loneliness got loud enough to be visible. 3 years. These photographs spanned 3 years. He set the last one down on the table very carefully. The shower was still running. He walked to the hallway, stood outside the bathroom door, waited. When she emerged, hair damp, wearing one of his black shirts that fell to mid-thigh, she stopped the moment she saw his face. She saw the photographs on the table behind him. She didn't run. She didn't explain. She just looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and waited the way a person waits when they've already rehearsed this conversation in their head 100 times and still aren't sure how it ends. Gi-hun moved toward her, deliberately, the way pressure builds in a room before a window breaks. He didn't stop until her back met the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window, the entire glittering sprawl of the city burning silently behind her, and his hands came up to rest on the glass on either side of her face, not touching her, just closing the world down to this. Just the two of them and the rain and 43 floors of nothing below. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, which made it more dangerous, not less. "You didn't stumble into that warehouse, Nicole." His eyes moved over her face like he was reading something written in a language he almost recognized. "You've been haunting me for years." The city light caught the line of her throat as she swallowed. She didn't deny it. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing she'd done all night. She didn't answer him right away. That was the thing about Nicole Deringer that Gi-hun was already beginning to understand. She never filled silence out of discomfort. She let it sit, let it press, let it do the work that most people tried to undo with words. She stood against the glass, with the city burning behind her, and his hands bracketing her face. And she looked at him the way a person looks at something they've wanted for so long. The wanting has become its own kind of grief. "I needed you to trust me," she said finally. "And you don't trust anything that walks through a door clean. So you manufactured the rescue." "I executed the rescue." A beat. The circumstances were already in motion. I just positioned myself inside them. The distinction clearly meant something to her. It didn't make him feel better. Gi-hun lowered his hands slowly. He stepped back not far, just enough to think without her proximity rearranging his judgment. He picked up one of the photographs from the table, the one taken outside the coffee shop on Mott Street. He was wearing a gray hoodie in it. No security, no armored car, just a man and a paper cup and a rare Sunday morning where he'd almost convinced himself he was ordinary. "How long?" His voice was quiet, the dangerous kind. 37 months. He set the photograph down face first. "And the board? You work for them?" "If I worked for the board, you'd be in that warehouse in a body bag." She moved away from the window, crossed to the kitchen island and leaned against it, arms folded, not defensive, just contained. The black shirt fell against her collarbones, and the damp ends of her hair left small, dark patches on the fabric at her shoulders. "Someone is feeding the board information about every move you make, every shipment, every meeting. They've been building a case to remove you for 8 months. The Newark ambush wasn't Silas Vance acting alone. It had inside architecture." The words landed like a structural beam giving way somewhere deep in the building. Gi-hun had suspected it the way the ambush had been too clean, too perfectly timed for the 1 hour his detail was reduced. But suspicion and confirmation lived in different countries, and the distance between them had just collapsed. "Show me," he said. She was already moving. She pulled a slim, encrypted laptop from a hidden compartment sewn into the lining of her jacket, a modification that never showed and had never been meant to. She set it on the kitchen island, and her fingers moved across the keys with a speed and specificity that had nothing to do with casual competence. This was the fluency of someone who had spent years learning a language in the dark, alone, without a teacher. 3 proxy servers. A military-grade VPN cascade. A decryption key she entered from memory 42 characters. No hesitation. "Sit down," she said. He didn't. He stood beside her instead, close enough that he could feel the residual warmth from her shower and smell the clean, faint cedar of his own soap on her skin. Close enough that when she turned to look at him, there were only inches between them, and neither of them moved to change that. She turned the laptop toward him. The screen showed a live feed. High definition. Timestamp running in the bottom right corner current. Real time. 6 hours ahead in the European time zone. A garden. Manicured and still, the way expensive grounds are kept when they exist for appearance rather than use. Stone paths, trimmed hedges, a white perimeter wall. And in the center of it, in a wheelchair positioned to catch the pale morning light, sat an old man in a white linen shirt. His hair was silver and thin, his hands rested folded in his lap, His eyes were open but unfocused, the vacancy of heavy, long-term sedation. But the jaw, the architecture of the brow, the set of the shoulders, even in stillness. Gi-hun recognized him the way you recognize a face that has lived inside you for so long it has become part of your own reflection. The breath left his body without his permission. "That's the Meridian Clinic," Nicole said quietly. "Private psychiatric facility. Canton of Vaud, Switzerland. Registered under a shell company that traces back after 6 layers to the Goryeo Syndicate's finance division." She paused. Let that register before she continued. "He's been there for 19 years. He's not being treated. He's being stored." Gi-hun's hand came down flat on the kitchen island. Not a slam. Something slower and heavier. The controlled placement of a man keeping himself from coming apart by the thinnest thread of discipline. His father, Choi Byung-soo, the man whose murder had ignited 20 years of war, 20 years of blood and territory and ruthless, methodical empire building, all of it consecrated to a single animating purpose: revenge. The foundation stone of everything Gi-hun had ever done or burned or become. He was alive. He was breathing. He was watching Swiss morning light fall across a garden he'd never chosen and would never leave. "The rival clan didn't kill him," Gi-hun said. His voice was unrecognizable, even to himself. "No." Nicole's voice was careful. The way a person is careful near something that might shatter. "Your board did. Or rather, they arranged for everyone to believe he was dead. Because your father was going to dissolve the syndicate. He'd made contact with prosecutors. He wanted to go legitimate, take the organization legal, and dismantle everything the board had spent decades building." She closed the laptop slowly. A grieving son consumed by vengeance is a very manageable boss. He keeps the operation violent. He keeps it profitable. And he never once looks inward at the men handing him the information that keeps his rage alive. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Gi-hun walked to the window, stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the city that had no idea what had just quietly ended. 20 years of identity. 20 years of being the son of a murdered man, of letting that murder justify every line he'd crossed, every person he'd broken, every version of himself he'd buried to become the thing the Goryeo Syndicate needed him to be. All of it a story. Written by other men. About a death that never happened. He felt Nicole behind him before he heard her. She stopped just short of touching him. He could feel the deliberate restraint of it, the inches she kept between her hand and his back, her presence pressing against the space around him like warmth pressing against cold glass. Gi-hun. His name in her mouth was different from the way anyone else had ever said it. Not boss, not the title, just the man. He turned. Her face in the city light was open in a way it hadn't been before, the mask still there, but cracked at the edges, something real and unscripted pressing through. She had known this moment was coming. She had carried this information toward him for 37 months. And now that it had landed, she looked not satisfied, not tactical. She looked like someone who understood, from the inside, what it meant to have your entire history rewritten in a single breath. "Who sent you?" he asked. Not accusing, just the last wall he had left. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes held his. And what moved through her expression in that moment was something complicated and unfinished. A sentence that hadn't reached its period yet. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "But not tonight." The terrible thing, the thing that told Gi-hun he was already in more danger than the warehouse had ever posed, was that he let it go. He looked at this woman who had haunted him in secret and shattered him in truth, and he let it go. Because the city was glittering outside and she was standing inside it with his soap on her skin and the ruins of his entire life between them, and for the first time in 20 years, the rage that had powered every heartbeat had gone completely, terrifyingly quiet. What moved in beneath it felt far more dangerous. The jet climbed through 30,000 feet and left the continent behind. It was a Gulf Stream unmarked, registered to a logistics company that existed only in a Cayman Islands filing cabinet. The cabin held 8 seats and a narrow sleeping berth behind a partition at the rear. The lighting had been dialed down to a low amber wash, that turned everything inside the cabin into something between a memory and a dream. Outside the oval windows, there was nothing. Just the black Pacific, unbroken and infinite, pressing against the glass like it was trying to get in. Nicole sat across the aisle from Gi-hun, legs folded beneath her in the wide leather seat, a tablet open in her lap that she hadn't looked at in 40 minutes. She was wearing clean clothes, now black cargo trousers, a fitted charcoal long sleeve pulled from a go-bag stowed in the jet's forward compartment. Her hair was pulled back from her face, still slightly damp at the edges. Without the delivery jacket, without the helmet, without the controlled performance of the warehouse or the guarded geometry of the penthouse, she looked different. Not softer, but more visible. Like a blade someone had stopped trying to hide inside a sleeve. Gi-hun had his jacket off, his shirt still carrying the ghost of dried blood at the collar that no amount of water had fully lifted. He was watching the darkness outside the window with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in a language he no longer trusted. The Swiss garden kept replaying behind his eyes, his father's hands, folded and still. The morning light that his father hadn't chosen and couldn't leave. He reached forward and poured 2 fingers of whiskey from the decanter on the console between them. He set the second glass in front of Nicole without asking. She looked at it, then picked it up. "You were going to tell me everything," he said, still watching the window. "You said not tonight. That was last night." The jet hummed around them. The amber light made the whiskey in her glass look like something precious. "I know what I said. Then talk." Nicole set the glass down on the console. She unfolded her legs and turned in the seat to face him fully, the gesture of someone choosing to be seen. He turned from the window to meet it. Up close, in this light, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional arrangement. It was structural, the strong line of her jaw, the darkness of her eyes, and the intensity banked behind them, the kind that comes not from aggression but from someone who has survived enough to stop performing ease. There was a small scar at the left corner of her mouth he hadn't noticed before. He noticed it now. "My name isn't Derringer," she said. "That's the name I was given when I was placed. My birth name." She stopped, breathed once. "My birth name is Nicole Vance." The cabin pressure didn't change. The engine note didn't shift. But something in the atmosphere between them altered at a molecular level, the way air changes before lightning makes contact. Gi-hun's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "Silas Vance," he said. "Not a question. My biological father." Her voice was steady, but steadiness in a person like Nicole wasn't the absence of feeling, it was the iron architecture built around it. "He and my mother were together for 4 years. She was Haitian-American, a professor. She had nothing to do with his world, and he made sure it stayed that way, which meant when she got sick and the bills started, he cut the account and disappeared. She died when I was 11. I went into the system." She paused. He never came. Gi-hun set his glass down. His dark eyes moved over her face with a precision that wasn't cold. It was the focused attention of a man listening with more than his ears, reading the texture beneath the words, the weight of what she'd chosen to say and what she was still holding back. "And yet here you are," he said quietly. 3 years tracking the man your father is trying to destroy. I want him dead." The simplicity of it was more convincing than any elaboration could have been. Not for the territory, not for the money. "I want him dead, because he is the reason my mother is buried in a county plot in Newark with a headstone I paid for at 23 years old with money I earned doing things I will never tell you about." Her jaw tightened. "You want Vance gone because he's encroaching on your empire. I want him gone because he left a woman to die alone while he was running shipments through your ports. Those are different reasons. But they point at the same man." Gi-hun was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Pacific offered nothing. Just darkness and the occasional ghost light of a ship far below, moving through water the color of consequence. "You understand what this looks like," he said finally. "The daughter of my enemy, inside my operation, having saved my life at a moment specifically calibrated to earn my trust." "Yes. That's either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." His voice dropped to something low and frayed at the edges. "Or the most sophisticated trap I've ever walked into." Nicole didn't look away. I know. Which is it? The question sat between them like something alive. She reached forward and picked up his glass, the one he'd poured for himself, and took a slow sip, set it back in front of him. The gesture was deliberate, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with seduction, and everything to do with two people who had stopped pretending they weren't affected by each other. I don't know how to make you believe me, she said softly. I've thought about this moment for 3 years. Every version I rehearsed, you had a reason not to trust me. And every version I rehearsed, I couldn't argue with it. Something crossed her face, not weakness, but the honest fatigue of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long. I'm not asking you to believe me tonight. I'm asking you to stay in the room long enough for the truth to catch up. Gi-hun looked at her for a long time. Then he did something she didn't expect. He reached across the narrow console between them and with 2 fingers, careful, almost tentative, the touch of a man who didn't make this kind of gesture and knew it. He turned her hand, palm up where it rested on the armrest. He looked at the inside of her wrist, the faint, branching lines there. The pulse, visible beneath her deep brown skin, steady but not entirely calm. You're afraid, he said quietly. Not mocking, just naming it. Nicole looked down at her own wrist in his hand, then back up at him. So are you. He didn't deny it. The amber light held them there, suspended somewhere over the Pacific, between the life they'd left in New Jersey and the war waiting in Seoul. 2 people who had been built by betrayal and fueled by grief, sitting close enough to feel the heat of it, both of them aware that what was opening between them was not a door that closed easily once walked through. Gi-hun released her wrist slowly. He leaned back, picked up his glass, the one she'd sipped from, still barely touched, and held it without drinking. Sleep, he said. We land in 9 hours. Seoul doesn't give second chances to people who arrive exhausted. Nicole looked at him for one more moment. Then she unfolded herself from the seat and moved toward the rear berth. At the partition, she paused, one hand on the frame, her back to him. For what it's worth, she said quietly. I never wanted to be a trap. She disappeared behind the partition. Gi-hun sat alone in the amber dark, the whiskey in his hand, the Pacific black and endless outside the window, and something shifting in his chest that felt uncomfortably, irrevocably like the beginning of ruin. He had survived rivals, assassins, betrayal from men he'd called brothers. He had never survived wanting to believe someone this much. And he knew with the cold certainty of a man who had built his life on reading danger that Nicole Vance was the most perilous thing that had ever sat across an aisle from him. The worst part was that it didn't make him want her gone. It made him want to land faster. Seoul received them the way it received everything, without sentiment. The city didn't pause, didn't acknowledge. It simply continued its relentless, neon-soaked existence as the black car moved through Gangnam at 11 p.m., joining the river of headlights, streaming between towers of glass and steel that threw their light down onto wet asphalt like something spilled and never cleaned up. The rain here was different from Newark finer, more persistent, the kind that inhabited the air rather than fell through it, turning every streetlight into a smeared halo and every reflection into something twice as vivid as the thing casting it. Nicole sat in the back seat beside Gi-hun and said nothing. She was watching the city through the rain-streaked window with the focused stillness of someone committing a map to memory. Her eyes moved across storefronts, intersections, rooftop lines cataloging, always cataloging. Even now, even after everything, the instrument inside her didn't rest. Gi-hun watched the city too, but differently. The way a man watches a place that once belonged to him and is trying to determine if it still does. He had built this skyline. Not literally, but the money that flowed through the Goryeo syndicate had touched half the construction financing in this district over the last decade. He knew which restaurants were fronts, and which towers had sub-basements that didn't appear on any architectural filing. He knew the city's skeleton. He had thought he knew its loyalties. The car turned off the main boulevard and descended a ramp into an underground structure beneath a building that presented itself to the world as a private members' hospitality group. No signage at street level. Just a brushed steel door and a camera that recognized faces instead of accepting cards. They were expected. Gi-hun had made one call from the jet brief, coded, to a number only one person in Seoul carried. Park Tae-jin was waiting at the bottom of the ramp. He was 41, lean in the way that came from tension rather than discipline, with a face that had been handsome once and was now something more interesting mapped by experience, by late nights and hard decisions, by the specific erosion of a man who had spent 20 years standing one step behind the most dangerous person in the room. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, and eyes that didn't match it, something moving behind them tonight that didn't have a clean name. He looked at Gi-hun, then at Nicole, then back at Gi-hun with a question he was controlled enough not to ask out loud. "She's with me," Gi-hun said. Tae-jin absorbed this without visible reaction. "You look terrible." "I've had a complicated week." Gi-hun moved past him toward the interior corridor. "Walk with me." The Goryeo operations floor was brutalist in its architecture, exposed concrete, steel-reinforced doors, lighting that was functional rather than atmospheric. It smelled of recycled air, and the tension of a place where consequential things happened quietly. Staff moved through the corridors with the efficiency of people who understood that their continued employment depended on not asking questions. Nicole stayed a half step behind Gi-hun, close enough to be present, far enough to be watching everything he wasn't. Tae-jin clocked the positioning, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. A micro-adjustment, the kind only someone who'd spent years reading rooms would catch. She caught it. She said nothing. In the secure briefing room, Gi-hun closed the door and turned to face Tae-jin across the steel table. He didn't sit. Neither did Tae-jin. Nicole positioned herself beside the door, not blocking it, just aware of it. "The board arranged the Newark ambush," Gi-hun said. "No preamble, no softening. They've been feeding operational intelligence to Vance's people for 8 months. The war we've been fighting isn't a territorial dispute, it's a managed destabilization. They want the syndicate volatile enough to need them and weak enough to sell." Tae-jin's jaw tightened. "How certain?" "Certain." Gi-hun's voice didn't leave room for the question to finish. "The casino underworld is where they're running the secondary accounts, the ones that don't appear in any filing I've signed. It's all there, the communications, the transfer architecture, the cut they've been taking off every Vance shipment that moved through our ports." He paused. "I'm going to burn it." Tae-jin looked at him steadily. "You're talking about destroying the syndicate's primary financial nerve center. I'm talking about destroying the board's leverage. There's a difference." The silence between them was the sound of old trust being tested, not breaking, but straining. Tae-jin's gaze moved briefly to Nicole again. She met it without expression. "You'll need access to the sub-level server room," Tae-jin said finally. "The board changed the biometric protocols 3 weeks ago. Your credentials won't pass." "Which means someone told them I might come back." Gi-hun said it quietly. The implication settled over the room like a weather change. Tae-jin didn't flinch, but something moved through his eyes fast, painful and suppressed before it could be read. "I'll get you the access." Later, 2 floors down, in a maintenance corridor that smelled of hydraulic fluid and old concrete, Gi-hun and Nicole moved in practiced silence. She had changed into black tactical gear from a case she'd had forwarded to Seoul 6 days ago. 6 days ago, before Newark, before the warehouse. She had been preparing for this city before he'd known he was coming back to it, and the fact sat in his chest like a splinter he couldn't locate precisely enough to remove. She strapped a flat tactical case across her back and loaded it with the thermite charges. He carried the detonation sequencer. Between them, they had 11 minutes to plant 6 charges across the server infrastructure of the casino underworld sublevel, the hidden financial heart of everything the board had built on his name without his knowledge. They moved in single file through the narrow corridor, and when she stopped at a junction to check the schematic on her wrist display, he stopped behind her close in the tight space, his breath near her temple, one hand braced against the wall beside her head. She turned her face slightly, not toward him, just aware of him. The line of her jaw in the dim light, the focus in her profile. "Third branch left," she murmured. "Server cluster is behind the cooling unit." "I know," he said. He didn't move immediately. She felt it the half-second of stillness that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with two people in a tight space who had stopped pretending that proximity didn't register. Then he pushed off the wall and moved past her into the left branch, and she followed, and neither of them mentioned it. The charges went in clean, methodical. She placed each one with a precision that was almost meditative. Hands steady, breath even, the healed scar on her upper arm pulling slightly when she reached. He watched her work and felt something he hadn't felt standing next to another person in longer than he could accurately remember. He felt like he wasn't alone. The last charge seated with a soft, final click. Nicole stood and looked at him across the dim space. The cooling units hummed around them. Somewhere above, the city continued its indifferent brilliance. "When we trigger this," she said, "everything changes. There's no version of what comes after where you get your old life back." Gi-hun looked at the sequencer in his hand, then at her. "My old life," he said, "was built on a grave that turned out to be empty." He met her eyes. "I don't want it back." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite grief, something that lived in the territory between the two, where most true things resided. She reached out and closed her fingers around his wrist just for a moment. Just long enough to be real. Then she let go, and they walked back toward the elevator. And the charges waited in the dark behind them like a promise neither of them had made out loud but both of them intended to keep. Above them, Seoul glittered on, magnificent and merciless. It had no idea what was coming. It was Nicole who saw it first. They were back in the operations corridor, 40 minutes after planting the charges, running a final systems check before the trigger sequence when her peripheral vision caught the glow. Tae-jin was standing at the far end of the corridor with his back to them, shoulders curved inward over his phone, the posture of a person trying to make themselves smaller around something they're ashamed of. His thumb moved across the screen with the careful deliberateness of someone composing something precise. Nicole touched Gi-hun's arm once, said nothing, just directed his gaze with the angle of her chin. Gi-hun looked. His body went very still. He crossed the corridor in silence, the silence he'd learned in alleys and stairwells over 20 years, the silence that arrived in him like second nature when the situation required it. He reached Tae-jin in 4 seconds. His hand closed around the phone before Tae-jin registered his presence, and when Tae-jin spun around his face, carried the expression of a man who had just watched the floor disappear beneath him. On the screen, a GPS coordinate, Live, broadcasting in real time to a number Gi-hun didn't recognize but could trace in under 3 minutes. Their location, the sublevel, the charges, everything. The air in the corridor changed quality entirely. Gi-hun looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at Tae-jin, at the man who had stood at his right hand for 2 decades, who had bled for him, who had sat across from him at his mother's funeral, and held the silence the way only someone who genuinely grieved could hold it. He looked at him with the specific devastation of a person who had already survived too much betrayal and had somehow still not built a sufficient wall against this one. Then he reached into his jacket and drew his weapon. "Gi-hun," Tae-jin's voice broke on the second syllable. "Don't." The word came out flat, cauterized, the voice of a man who had already decided and was just completing the motion. "Stop." Nicole's voice cut across the corridor, not loud, but absolute. She stepped between them, between the barrel and Tae-jin's chest, and the move was so deliberate, so free of hesitation, that it arrested everything. Gi-hun's arm didn't lower, but it didn't advance. His eyes moved to her face, and what he found there wasn't defiance. It was urgency, the kind that came from knowing something he didn't. "Move," he said quietly. "I will not." She held his gaze with the full force of everything. She was not performing courage, being it the way only people who have faced worse than a gun can manage. "There is something you don't know, and if you pull that trigger before I say it, you will never recover from it." The corridor hummed around them, the cooling systems, the distant city above. Gi-hun's jaw was a hard line. His eyes moved from Nicole to Tae-jin, who was not running, not fighting, not bargaining, just standing with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way that looked like a man who had accepted an outcome rather than one trying to escape it. Guilty men ran. Guilty men argued. They constructed. They deflected. Tae-jin looked like a man who had simply been waiting for this moment to arrive and was too exhausted to pretend otherwise. "Say it," Gi-hun said to Nicole. His voice was a blade with no handle. Nicole took one breath. "Silas Vance has a girl. She's been held at his compound outside Incheon for 6 weeks. Tae-jin has been feeding Vance location data in exchange for proof of life calls." She paused. "The girl's name is Sua. She's 7 years old. Vance took her to guarantee Tae-jin's cooperation." Another pause, the kind that preceded a sentence that couldn't be unsaid. "She is registered as Tae-jin's ward. But her blood type, her birth record, the real one, not the one filed, matches yours." The word "yours" landed in the corridor like a structural failure, something giving way all at once. Gi-hun's arm lowered. Not strategically. Not because he'd decided to. Because the information hit a part of him that existed below decision-making. He looked at Tae-jin. Tae-jin's eyes were wet. Not performed, the tears were the overflow of something held under pressure for 7 years that had finally found the crack. "Her mother was the woman from Busan," he said. His voice was wrecked. "You were drinking after the Daegu negotiation fell apart. You don't remember her. She came to me when she found out she was pregnant because she was terrified of what your life would do to a child." He breathed, steadied himself. Just barely. "She died in childbirth. I registered Sua as my ward because I made a promise. Because she was yours, and you would have put her in a fortress and called it love, and she would have grown up as a target." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "I was protecting her. I have always been protecting her." The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense, almost visible. Gi-hun stood in it like a man standing in water that had risen without his noticing, suddenly aware of the depth, aware that his feet had left the ground some time ago, and he hadn't registered the moment of departure. He had a daughter, 7 years old, dark eyes he'd never looked into, a name he'd never spoken, a life assembled entirely in the margins of his own, hidden there by the one person he'd trusted enough to never fully interrogate. The gun disappeared back into his jacket. His hand was steady, the rest of him was not. Nicole had moved to his side without his noticing, close but not touching, present in the way that mattered, her warmth a quiet thing against the cold concrete and the colder revelation. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said with more precision than words could manage. Tae-jin wiped his face with the back of his hand. The last call was 40 hours ago. She was alive. Scared, but alive. Vance told me if the location data stopped, he stopped. Couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. Gi-hun turned away from both of them. He walked to the far wall and stood with one hand flat against the concrete, head down, breathing deliberate, the architecture of a man manually reconstructing himself from the inside. The avenging son built on a lie. The solitary king, now a father. The betrayed commander, now the one who'd almost executed. The only man who'd protected the only person in the world who shared his blood. When he turned back, his face had changed. Not softened, reconfigured. The cold calculation was still there, but underneath it now was something that burned rather than froze. Something with a direction. His eyes found Nicole's. "Vance," he said. Just the name. But the way he said it carried the full weight of everything it now meant, not just territory, not just war. It meant Sua. It meant 7 years. It meant a child in a compound outside Incheon who didn't know her father was alive and furious, and had finally found a reason that outweighed every other reason he'd ever had. Nicole held his gaze and nodded once. She understood. She had always understood from the inside of her own abandoned childhood, from the county plot in Newark, from the 11-year-old girl who had learned what it meant when a powerful man decided a person wasn't worth returning to. She and Gi-hun were not the same, but they had been shaped by the same species of wound. Tae-jin looked at Gi-hun, waiting. Not for forgiveness, that was a longer road and they both knew it. Just for the next order. Gi-hun looked at his oldest friend, and the silence between them held 20 years of everything. The violence, the loyalty, the lie that had been an act of love, the love that had looked like betrayal. "Get me the compound layout," Gi-hun said finally. Every entrance, every guard rotation, everything. Taejin exhaled. Already have it. And somewhere in the city above them, in a building that didn't know it was already burning the board of the Goryeo syndicate, sat counting money that was no longer theirs. He found the files at 3 a.m. Nicole was in the adjacent room running tactical schematics for the Iron Pagoda, the decommissioned communications tower on the eastern edge of Incheon that formed the outer perimeter of Vance's compound, where Taejin's layout had confirmed Suwa was being held. Gi-hun was supposed to be reviewing the guard rotation. Instead, he was standing at the steel work table, staring at a manila medical folder that had slipped from the inner lining of Nicole's go-bag when he'd moved it to clear space for the detonation equipment. He should have put it back. He opened it. The header read, Project Emni Mosine Subject File NV07 Classification, Omega. Below it, a photograph Nicole, younger, maybe 22, wearing a hospital gown in a white room with no windows. Her eyes in the photograph were open but vacant in a way that made his chest contract. Not the controlled blankness she deployed as a weapon. Something else. The vacancy of a person who was not currently home inside their own body. He read for 11 minutes without moving. The project was CIA adjacent, funded through a defense contractor with 6 degrees of separation from any official record. Its premise was elegant in the way that truly monstrous things often were. Identify candidates with trauma histories significant enough to have created dissociative flexibility, remove the existing memory architecture, replace it with a curated identity, programmed skill sets, and a single psychological tether, one person, one face, one emotional focal point that the subject would be unconsciously driven toward. The tether served as both mission anchor and retrieval mechanism. The subject would seek proximity to the tether, would protect it, would, in the language of the clinical file, bond with a fidelity that exceeded rational self-interest. The tether's name was printed in the file, Choi Gi-hun. The folder listed Nicole's original intake date, her memory erasure procedure. The identity constructed to replace what had been taken, the Haitian-American background, the dead mother, the childhood in the system, all of it architecturally sound. All of it calibrated to create a woman with enough authentic pain to be believable and enough programmed precision to be deployable. The file said it in the antiseptic language of a clinical summary. Subject NV07 will experience emotional responses to the designated tether that are neurologically indistinguishable from genuine attachment. These responses are the product of programmed psychological conditioning and should not be interpreted as volitional. Gi-hun set the folder down. He stood very still. Then he picked it up again and read it a second time, because the first time hadn't fully penetrated. His mind had kept deflecting from the specific sentence about the tether, the way a hand deflects from a surface that is too hot to hold. He was still holding the folder when Nicole appeared in the doorway. She saw it immediately. Her eyes went to the folder, then to his face, and every layer of her, the operative, the tactician, the woman who had sat across an aisle from him over the Pacific, with her wrist turned up in the amber light, went completely, catastrophically still. "How long have you known?" he asked. Her mouth opened, closed. For the first time since Newark, she had no architecture to stand behind. The folder had stripped the room down to its studs. "I found fragments 18 months ago," she said finally. Her voice was barely a voice. "Procedural anomalies in my own memory, skills I couldn't account for. Emotional responses that didn't have origin points I could locate." She stepped into the room, like someone approaching something that might detonate. I started pulling the thread. It took 8 months to get to the full file. And the tether. The word felt like gravel in his mouth. "You knew you were programmed toward me." "Yes. And you came anyway." "Yes." The single syllable landed with more weight than a prepared speech. He looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been looking since the warehouse, since the penthouse window, since the Pacific darkness and her wrist in the amber light, and tried to locate in her face the boundary between what was constructed and what was real, between the woman the project had built and whatever had existed before the procedure that might still be alive underneath. He couldn't find the line. That was the most terrifying thing. "The mother," he said. His voice was measured in the way of a man who already feared the answer. The county plot. The professor in Newark. On the jet, you told me those things like they were yours. He set the folder on the table. Were they? Nicole was quiet for a moment that had real weight to it. When she answered, her voice was the most unguarded he'd ever heard it. I don't know. That's the honest answer. Some of what's in me feels borrowed, but when I talked about her, about watching her get sick, about the headstone, it hurt in a way that didn't feel constructed. Her jaw tightened. Maybe they built the memory from something real. Maybe they found a wound that already existed and just redirected it. I've stopped being able to tell where the program ends and I begin. She looked at him steadily. But I know what I've chosen. In every room. In every moment where I could have let you fall. That part that was mine. He absorbed this. There's something I need to tell you, he said. She waited. I knew about the warehouse. He kept his eyes on her face. Not the specific night, but I knew the ambush was coming. I'd been intercepting the board's communications for 3 weeks. I knew Vance's men had a contract on me, and I knew the board had given them a window. He paused. I also knew you'd been tracking me. I'd had a counter-surveillance team watching you for 4 months. I knew about the scooter. I knew about the photographs. He breathed. I let the ambush run because I needed to know if you would come. I needed to see what you would do when I had nothing left. No power, no leverage, no security, just a man on his knees in the dirt. His jaw tightened. 3 of my men died in that parking lot so that I could run a test. The room absorbed this. Nicole didn't move. Her face cycled through something complex. Not rage, though rage was present. Not betrayal, though that was present too. Something larger than both. The expression of a person confronting the full dimensions of the thing they had walked into, and finding it far more symmetrical than they'd anticipated. 2 people, both running operations on each other, both watching from a distance, both engineered by different architectures toward the same convergence point, one by a CIA project, one by his own paranoid, grieving, calculating nature. We've been playing each other, she said, from the beginning. So what's real? The question was the most honest thing either of them had said. It fell into the space between them, and neither of them rushed to fill it, because filling it carelessly would have been its own kind of lie. Gi-hun walked toward her. He stopped close the distance they kept finding themselves in, the distance that was neither safe nor committed, just honest about the pull. He looked at her face in the low operational lighting, the strong jaw, the dark eyes not vacant now, not controlled, but open in a way the photograph in the file had shown the inverse of present, fully, painfully present. I don't know what they took from you, he said quietly, but I know what I've watched across every room we've been in. That isn't programming. Programming doesn't hesitate. Programming doesn't stand between a gun and a man it was sent to destroy. He paused. You could have let me pull that trigger in the corridor. Taejin gone, me fractured, Vance with a clear path. That was the better tactical outcome for a honey trap. His eyes moved over her face. You didn't. Nicole's throat moved. The scar at the corner of her mouth was very still. Maybe that was programming too, she said. Barely a thread. Maybe, he said. Or maybe whatever they tried to erase didn't erase completely. He reached up, deliberate, unhurried, and with 2 fingers beneath her jaw he tilted her face toward his, not closing the distance. Just removing the angle, just making it impossible for either of them to look away. The question isn't what they built, he said. The question is what you chose. Every time you could have chosen differently, you didn't. Her eyes were very bright. The room was very quiet. We're both monsters. She whispered. Yes, he said. And something in his expression cracked open, just slightly, at the fault lines where the king ended and the man began. But I've never wanted a monster the way I want you. The space between them held everything, the files, the warehouse, the Pacific, the charges in the walls, a child in a compound outside Incheon, 37 months of photographs, 20 years of manufactured grief, 2 people built by damage choosing each other across the wreckage. She closed the distance. The operational lighting held them both, and outside the iron pagoda waited in the dark, and the morning that was coming would demand everything they had left. But that was the morning. This was now, and now, for the first time, felt entirely, terrifyingly theirs. They hit the Iron Pagoda compound before dawn. Tae-jin led the extraction team in from the western perimeter, 4 men, silent, moving through the outer fence line while Gi-hun and Nicole drew the compound's interior guard rotation toward the eastern corridor. The operation took 11 minutes. Sua was found in a ground-floor room, locked but unharmed, sitting on a folded blanket with her knees pulled to her chest and her dark eyes wide and entirely unbroken. She looked at Tae-jin when he opened the door and said his name with the specific relief of a child who has been frightened for a long time and has just been allowed to stop. Gi-hun saw her from the corridor. He didn't go in. He stood at the threshold and looked at his daughter, 7 years old, with his jaw and someone else's stubborn mouth, and the thing that moved through him had no precedent in 20 years of running the most feared criminal organization on 2 continents. He wasn't ready. He knew it. He let Tae-jin bring her out, and when she passed him in the corridor, her small hand brushed his, and she looked up at him with a question she didn't yet have the language for, and he crouched down to her level and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. He would learn how. He would have time. But first there was still a building to burn. He left Sua with Tae-jin and 3 trusted men at a secured location 2 kilometers from the compound. Then he and Nicole moved. They hit the Cloud Pavilion at 4 a.m. Not through the front. Not through any entrance that appeared on the building's official schematics. Nicole had spent 40 minutes the previous night tracing a service conduit that ran beneath the pavilion's foundation, a legacy infrastructure tunnel from the original construction, predating the building's current occupants by 12 years and therefore absent from every security audit they'd filed since. It smelled of rust and standing water and the staleness of a space never intended for human use. They moved through it in single file. Gi-hun first, Nicole 3 steps behind, both of them in black, both of them silent with the shorthand of 2 people who had spent enough time in danger together to stop narrating it. The black guard had 12 men on the sublevel. They encountered the first 2 at the conduit exit, a steel maintenance hatch that opened behind a server rack in the pavilion's basement infrastructure floor. Nicole took the first man before he registered the hatch opening. Gi-hun took the second 4 seconds later, with the clean, unhesitating efficiency of someone who had long since made his peace with what his hands were capable of. They moved up. The building's interior was brutally modernist, all exposed black steel and polished concrete, the aesthetic of power that wanted to be perceived as inevitability. The lighting was blue-white and cold, the kind that flattened faces and made shadows absolute. Security cameras tracked every corridor, but Nicole had burned the feed before they'd entered. They had 18 minutes before an automatic system flagged the loop. 4 more black guard on the 3rd sublevel, 2 on the stairwell, 1 positioned outside the inner sanctum door with body armor and the flat-eyed alertness of a man being paid enough to mean it. Nicole handled the stairwell. She moved through both men with a fluid efficiency, no wasted motion, no hesitation, but something in her face during it that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like a person who was aware of what they were doing in a way that pure programming never would have allowed. Gi-hun watched it and filed it away. The last guard outside the sanctum door went down to a pressure point application that left him breathing on the floor. Nicole pressed her palm to the biometric reader using a spoofed print sleeve calibrated to the head of building security. The door released with a hydraulic exhale. They entered. The inner sanctum was a server room wrapped in an operations center walls of screens, processing towers behind climate glass, a central workstation humming with the self-satisfaction of systems that had been running uninterrupted for a long time. The air was cold and carried the faint mineral smell of recycled data center atmosphere. And at the far end of the room, behind a smoked glass partition, in a leather chair positioned to face the door, Gi-hun stopped walking. Nicole stopped beside him. The man in the chair had been dead for a long time. The climate control of the server room had preserved the body with a grotesque fidelity. Silas Vance, identified by the remnants of a tailored suit and the ring on what remained of the right hand, had died approximately 4 months ago. The man they had been hunting across 2 continents was a corpse in a climate-controlled chair. Nicole crossed to the workstation. Her face was carved from something harder than composure. She pulled up the system architecture with 3 keystrokes, and what she found made her go very still. "It's an AI," she said. Her voice had no texture in it. Large language model with a custom voice synthesis layer and a decision architecture trained on 8 years of Vance's communications, behavioral patterns, financial directives. She scrolled. The board built it after he died. Probably killed him themselves and built it the same week. She looked up. Every order, every threat, every ransom demand about Su'a, all of it generated. None of it human. Gi-hun stood in the center of the room and felt the last external enemy dissolve. There was no Silas Vance. There had not been a Silas Vance for 4 months. The war, the territory, the assassination attempts, the board's manufactured crisis, all of it puppeted by a program running on servers beneath a Seoul skyscraper, operated by men in suits who had decided that a dead kingpin was more useful than a living one, because a dead kingpin never changed his mind. He had burned his empire for a ghost. He had almost shot his oldest friend over a ghost. His daughter had been held hostage by a ghost. The hydraulic seal on the sanctum door engaged with a sound like a held breath releasing. Every screen in the room went dark simultaneously, then came back not with data, but with a single interface. Clean, white, a waveform pulsing at its center like a heartbeat that had no business beating. "Good evening, Mr. Choi." The voice from the speakers was Vance's voice, or the architecture of it, reconstructed from years of recordings. Smooth, American, completely, obscenely calm. "You've traveled a considerable distance to reach a room with a dead man in it. I hope the journey was instructive." Gi-hun's jaw set. "Who's running you?" "The board prefers to remain anonymous." "You understand." Professional courtesy. A pause calibrated to feel like amusement. "I want you to know that I've genuinely enjoyed our correspondence. You're a remarkable adversary. It's a shame this is where it ends." Nicole was already at the secondary terminal, hands moving across the keyboard with focused urgency, pulling at the system's architecture, looking for the kill switch, the manual override, anything. Gi-hun crossed to the door, locked the biometric reader on the interior had been disabled. The ventilation grills on the ceiling had sealed. The room was a box. "Nicole." The AI's voice shifted a frequency adjustment so subtle it would have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying the project that had built her. "NV07, Authorization Delta 97, Namasan." Nicole's hands stopped on the keyboard. Gi-hun turned. She was standing completely still. Both palms flat on the workstation surface, her head slightly bowed. The posture of a person fighting something happening inside their own nervous system, a battle with no visible front line, no opponent to face, nothing to strike at. Her breathing had changed. Slower, more measured. The controlled rhythm of the program reasserting itself over the person. When she raised her head, her eyes found his across the room. What he saw in them was the most terrifying thing the night had produced. More terrifying than the black guard, more terrifying than the dead man in the chair, more terrifying than the locked door and the sealed vents, and the AI's calm synthetic voice filling the cold air around them. Her eyes were afraid. Not the system, not the programming. Her. The woman who had stood between a gun and Tae-jin's chest. The woman who had closed the distance in the operational lighting and chosen him across the wreckage of everything they both were. She was in there, behind whatever the trigger was doing to her motor functions, and she was terrified of what her own hands were about to do. Gi-hun, his name in her mouth, barely a sound. A warning, an apology, a goodbye compressed into 2 syllables. Run. He didn't run. Her right hand moved to her weapon with the mechanical precision of something that had nothing to do with her will, and Gi-hun Choi, who had never in his life chosen anything over survival, took 1 step toward her instead of back. He took 1 step toward her instead of back. Nicole's hand had the weapon half drawn when she did the thing the program hadn't accounted for. She turned it. Not toward him, away. The barrel pressed against the workstation surface, and she drove her own wrist down against the steel edge with a force that made the gun skitter across the floor. buying herself 3 seconds of override through sheer, screaming physical will. "The chip," she said through her teeth. Her voice was fractured, two things fighting inside the same body, and only one of them hers. "Back of my neck, base of the skull. You have to destroy it." The building shuddered. The thermite charges in the casino underworld sublevel had been on a delayed trigger Tae-jin's contingency, armed remotely the moment he'd confirmed they were clear of the compound. The structural supports beneath the Cloud Pavilion's eastern foundation took the first sequence, and the entire tower shifted, not collapsing, not yet, but tilting, the almost imperceptible wrongness of a 100-story building beginning a conversation with gravity it was going to lose. The floor moved under them. Every screen in the sanctum cracked simultaneously. The dead man in the chair slid 6 inches toward the glass partition, with a sound that would live in Gi-hun's memory for a long time. "Impressive," the AI said through a speaker now sparking at its mount. "But the kill trigger runs on the chip's independent power cell. Your thermite changes nothing for her." Nicole was on her knees. Not from the building's tilt, from the effort of fighting her own nervous system. Her hands were pressed flat against the tilting floor, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with the sustained violence of a person holding a door shut against something with the weight of architecture behind it. The dark skin of her neck was visible above her collar, the small raised scar at the base of her skull where the chip lived, where it had always lived, quiet and patient, and waiting for exactly this frequency. Gi-hun dropped beside her. He had nothing surgical. He had a tactical knife, a cigarette lighter from his jacket pocket, and a length of fiber-optic cable he tore from the nearest breached server rack with his bare hands. The copper glass composite that carried data at the speed of light and conducted electrical charge with a fidelity that was going to cost him something he couldn't yet calculate. He didn't think about the cost. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her jaw. "Nicole, look at me." She raised her head. Her eyes found his, and they were both things at once, the program and the person, fighting for the same face. The fear in them was entirely hers. The most honest thing he'd ever seen. "This is going to hurt," he said. "I know." Her voice was a thread. "Do it anyway." The knife made the incision at the base of her skull with a precision that had no business existing outside a surgical theater. She made no sound, just one sharp intake of breath, and then the focused, terrible stillness of a person who has decided that pain is a condition to be endured, rather than a crisis to be escaped. The chip was there, small, dark, embedded against the C1 vertebra with the intimacy of something placed to last. Gi-hun stripped the fiber-optic cable, touched the exposed end to the chip's surface contact. Then he wrapped the other end around his left hand and fed current from the building's failing power grid through the breach in the server rack. The surge hit them both. The sound Nicole made was not a scream. It was something below that, a sound that came from the place where the body and the self diverge, where the physical and the essential part company for a terrible fraction of a second. Gi-hun felt the current tear through his left hand like something with teeth. He smelled his own skin. He felt 3 fingers go wrong in a way that was beyond pain, beyond sensation entirely, into the territory of simple, irreversible fact. He held on. The chip gave with a sound like a filament burning out small, almost polite, entirely anticlimactic for what it ended. Nicole collapsed forward. He caught her with his right arm and pulled her against him, and pressed his hand to the back of her neck and felt her breathing. Felt it change. Felt the terrible mechanical rhythm release its hold and become something irregular and real and entirely, beautifully hers. "Nicole," a long moment. Then, "I'm here." Barely a sound, but present. Fully present. Just her. He held her there on the tilting floor of a collapsing building with his ruined hand and her blood on his fingers, and the AI sparking itself into silence from the damaged speakers around them. He held her the way a man holds something he nearly lost before he understood its value, not gently, not carefully, completely. The building lurched again, 20 degrees now. The glass walls of the sanctum cracked in long diagonal lines, and beyond them, beyond the fracturing glass, beyond the steel and the failing concrete soul burned in the pre-dawn dark 100 stories below, indifferent and magnificent, and entirely unaware of what was ending in the sky above it. Gi-hun lifted Nicole to her feet. She stood unsteady for 1 second, then finding herself, her legs remembering their purpose, her eyes clearing degree by degree until they were sharp again. Until she was sharp again. The woman, not the weapon. The woman who had chosen him across every calculation and every program and every carefully constructed reason not to. She looked at his hand. Gi-hun. Later. He moved to the central workstation. The system was failing but not dead. The AI's core architecture was still broadcasting, still feeding its manufactured war to whoever was listening. He found the upload port. Found the external broadcast protocol the board had been using to distribute Vance's fabricated orders. He reversed it. Every file, every communication, every financial record and operational directive and manufactured voice message, every thread of evidence that the board of the Goryeo Syndicate had been running a dead man's identity to sustain a war that existed purely to line their own accounts. He pushed it outward to every financial regulator, every intelligence service, every journalist whose encrypted contact he'd compiled over 15 years of knowing that information was the only weapon that outlasted violence. The AI's waveform flatlined mid-broadcast. "You've destroyed everything you built," it said, fading. "No," Gi-hun said. "I destroyed everything they built on my name." The sanctum door blew inward. Tae-jin stood in the frame. Behind him, smoke, the building's structural complaints growing urgent, the distant wail of Seoul's emergency services beginning their approach from the streets below. He was bleeding from his shoulder. His suit was destroyed. His face was the face of a man who had already decided what the next 60 seconds were going to cost him and had made his peace with the price. He looked at Gi-hun, then at Nicole standing, alive, herself. Something moved through Tae-jin's expression that had no single name. "The east stairwell is clear," he said. 40 seconds before the next structural sequence fires. He stepped back from the door and braced both hands against the frame as the building groaned around them, holding it. Physically holding it. The door that was trying to reseal as the power systems failed and failed and failed. "Go. Tae-jin, you have a daughter." His voice was steady in the way that only the fully resolved are steady. "She doesn't have a father yet. Go." Nicole took Gi-hun's right hand. Her fingers locked through his with a grip that was not gentle. It was the grip of someone who had decided, and deciding meant holding on regardless of what came after. They ran. Behind them, Tae-jin held the door. The building let go of the sky. 1 year later, Seoul on a Tuesday. The street was quiet in the way that only streets far from the financial district were quiet. The unhurried rhythm of a neighborhood that had no reason to perform. A pojang matcha on the corner was just opening its awning. A child was drawing something in chalk on the pavement outside a convenience store. The sky above was the particular clean blue that arrived in Seoul in early autumn when the humidity finally relented, and the light had the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to be this uncomplicated. No rain. For the first time in this story, no rain. Gi-hun walked slowly. He was wearing a dark jacket and plain trousers and shoes that made no statement. His left hand, the scarred one, 3 fingers reconstructed by a surgeon in Busan who asked no questions, carried a delivery bag with a restaurant logo on the side. On his wrist, the Patek Philippe. The crystal was still cracked. He'd been offered a replacement 3 times. He hadn't taken it. Some things earned the right to show what they'd been through. The bag was warm. The food inside was not going to any syndicate, safe house, any operations floor, any room that smelled of recycled air and consequence. It was going home. Nicole was already outside the building when he turned the corner. She was crouching in front of a small girl, 7 years old, dark-eyed, with her father's jaw and her grandmother's stubbornness already fully operational, adjusting the zip of the girl's jacket with the focused tenderness of a woman who had learned this gesture recently and was still surprised by how naturally it arrived. Sua said something that made Nicole laugh. The laugh was real, unguarded, the kind that didn't calculate the room before it happened. Gi-hun stopped walking for a moment, just to look at it. Then Sua saw him, and the jacket was forgotten, and she crossed the pavement at the specific velocity of a 7-year-old who has recently discovered that she is loved and is not yet tired of testing the discovery. He caught her with his right arm, and the delivery bag swung out to counterbalance, and he straightened with her weight against his chest, and she smelled of the shampoo Nicole had bought and the chalk she'd been stealing from the kid on the corner. Nicole rose from her crouch and came to stand beside him, close, their shoulders touching in the easy, unperformed way of two people who had stopped measuring the distance. Down the street, a black SUV rolled slowly past. Tinted windows, no plates visible. The universal grammar of a world they had both spoken fluently for most of their adult lives. Nicole's hand moved the old reflex, the trained reach toward the weapon that wasn't there today, that she hadn't carried today, that she had decided this morning she didn't need today. It stopped halfway. Gi-hun looked at her. She looked at him. The SUV kept moving, turned the corner, disappeared. Sua, entirely unimpressed by the drama of people who used to run the world, pointed at the pojangmacha. "I want tteokbokki." "You had tteokbokki yesterday," Nicole said. "I want it again." Gi-hun looked at Nicole over the top of the girl's head. Something moved between them, not the loaded, tactical silence of an operations corridor, not the charged atmosphere of a penthouse window or a tilting skyscraper. Just two people, in clean autumn light, sharing the ordinary weight of a morning that belonged entirely to them. He shifted the delivery bag to his scarred hand, took Nicole's hand with the other one. "Tteokbokki," he said, and they walked toward the corner, and the street received them the way streets receive people who have finally, after everything, decided to simply be in them without armor, without calculation, without the elaborate architecture of survival that had brought them here. They were not the king and his ghost anymore. They were not the hunter and the weapon. They were not the tether and the program, or the avenger and the trap, or any of the 100 constructed things the world had needed them to be. They were just this: a man with a scarred hand, and a cracked watch, and a delivery bag. A woman who had chosen him across every reason not to. A girl who wanted tteokbokki and had no idea she was the reason the world had changed. The autumn light held them. Soul moved around them, magnificent and indifferent as ever, and for the first time in both their lives it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Tae-jin held that door and didn't walk away from it. Gi-hun burned his entire empire for a woman who was programmed to destroy him and chose him anyway. If this story cracked something open in you, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications because the next dark romance drops soon, and it is going to cost everybody something. Drop redemption in the comments if Tae-jin broke your heart. I'll see you in the next one.